Stalin gave his army 12 days. 12 days to crush a country smaller than the Soviet Union's own peacetime army? 12 days. That's it. That's what Moscow told the men marching west in November 1939. Pack light. You won't need winter gear. You'll be home before the snow really falls. They laughed about it around the campfires. Officers joked that the hardest part of the invasion would be the parade through Helsinki. Some units didn't even bring white camouflage. Why would they? This wasn't a war. This was a formality. Then the forest went quiet. No warning shots. No shouted commands. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses on your eardrums. The kind that makes a man's own breathing sound too loud. A single crack echoed through the trees. Then another. Officers dropped first, the men giving orders, the men holding maps, the men who knew where they were. One by one. No pattern a panicking soldier could predict. No muzzle flash they could trace back through the snow. Within minutes, a column of over 100 vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery, sat frozen on a single forest road, unable to turn, unable to retreat, unable to see who was killing them. They had been told this army was a formality. They were about to learn its name. This is the story of how a nation of 3.5 million people humiliated the largest army on earth, and how the man behind it almost never got the chance to fight at all. To understand what happened in those forests, you need to understand the math Stalin was working with. The Soviet Union in 1939 had roughly 170 million people. Finland had 3.7 million. The Red Army alone outnumbered the entire population of Finland's fighting-age men by a margin that should have made this war over in a week. Stalin wanted a buffer. Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city, sat just 20 miles from the Finnish border. Close enough that Finnish artillery, in theory, could reach it. Stalin demanded Finland hand over territory to push that border back. Finland refused. So on the 30th of November 1939, over 20 Soviet divisions crossed into Finland from multiple directions. Tanks, artillery, air support. An army built for the plains of Europe, thrown into a country that was almost entirely dense pine forest, frozen lakes, and narrow dirt roads. And here is where the arrogance started costing lives before a single shot was even psychological. Soviet planners had assumed a quick, conventional war. Roll the tanks down the roads. Take the towns. Declare victory. Nobody in the high command seriously planned for what happens when your entire army has to move through forests so thick that tanks can't leave the road, in temperatures that would eventually drop to -40 degrees, against an enemy who had grown up on skis before they'd learned to properly walk. Soviet soldiers arrived in standard-issue brown-gray uniforms. Against snow, they were walking targets. Many units had no winter boots at all, just standard leather footwear that froze solid within hours. Frostbite would eventually claim more Soviet casualties in this war than Finnish bullets did. The roads themselves became death traps. In forested terrain, a mechanized column can only move in one direction, forward, in a single file. Because there's nowhere else to go. That single fact, an army too large and too rigid to leave its own roads, was about to be turned into a weapon. The man who understood this better than almost anyone in Finland's high command wasn't some celebrated general with a chest full of medals. His name was Hjalmar Siilasvuo, a reserve officer, a lawyer in civilian life. He had no grand reputation before this war. He wasn't Mannerheim, the legendary commander-in-chief whose name Finns already knew. Siilasvuo was by most measures exactly the kind of unremarkable, overlooked officer that a desperate high command throws at a crisis because there's simply no one else left to send. He was handed command of Finnish forces facing the Soviet Ninth Army near a small town called Suomussalmi, a name that meant nothing to the world in November 1939 and would mean everything to it by January. His troops were outnumbered by more than 3-1. Farmers, hunters, reservists barely out of their winter coats from home. Many of them had grown up skiing to school. That detail, treated as a rural curiosity by the men in Moscow's war rooms, was about to become the single most decisive military advantage of the entire war. Siilasvuo had studied the terrain the Soviets were marching through. He knew something the enemy commanders didn't seem to grasp. This forest wasn't empty land to be crossed. It was a weapon, sitting there, waiting to be picked up. He proposed a tactic that some of his own superiors thought was reckless. Don't meet the Soviet columns head-on. You'll lose that fight. They have more tanks, more men, more artillery. Instead, let them keep moving forward. Let them stretch themselves out along the road, mile after mile, convoy after convoy. And then cut them into pieces. The tactic didn't even have a proper military name yet. The Finns started calling it motti, a word that, before the war, simply meant a stacked pile of firewood logs, cut and ready for the axe. That's exactly how they intended to treat the Red Army. Here's how it worked. In the simplest terms, a Soviet column, dozens of vehicles long, is crawling down a single forest road because there is no other route. Finnish ski troops, small teams, moving silently through the trees on either side, invisible in white camouflage, don't attack the column head-on. They cut it. Small ambush teams strike at multiple points along the column simultaneously, severing it into isolated segments. A section of tanks here, a section of trucks there. Suddenly, a single continuous army of thousands becomes a dozen separate, cut-off pockets, each one surrounded, each one unable to reach the others for support. Then the Finns simply wait. No massive frontal assault. No suicidal charge into superior firepower. Just relentless, grinding pressure from the tree line. Snipers picking off officers. Ski patrols hitting supply lines at night, then vanishing before dawn. Small raids designed not to destroy the pocket in one blow, but to slowly starve it, freeze it, and terrify it into collapse. To the men back in Moscow's planning rooms, it must have sounded almost embarrassing. Farmers on skis, cutting up a mechanized Soviet army with sniper rifles and improvised weapons? One of the crudest tools in that improvised arsenal was a simple glass bottle filled with fuel, a rag stuffed in the top as a wick. Soviet propaganda had mockingly labeled Finnish bombs as coming from Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, so the Finns, with grim humor, started calling their homemade firebombs Molotov cocktails. A drink, they said, to go with his bombs. It looked laughable. A bottle against a tank. It worked. What made the motti tactic so devastating wasn't just the casualties. It was what it did to the minds of the men trapped inside it. Picture it from inside one of those isolated pockets. You're a Soviet soldier. Your convoy has stopped moving. Word comes back that the column ahead of you has been cut off, you can't advance, and you can't retreat either. Because the road behind you has been severed too. You're sitting in temperatures of -30, -40 degrees in a uniform that wasn't built for this. Your boots are freezing to your feet. Your rifle's metal parts are so cold that skin can stick to them. And then, at night, the forest starts talking. Ski patrols would strike in darkness, hit hard, and disappear back into the trees before return fire could even be organized. No warning. No pattern. A soldier could stand watch for 6 hours and see nothing but snow, and then his neighbor, 10 feet away, would simply be gone. Rumors spread faster than any radio report could travel. Whispers of white ghost soldiers who could move through deep snow silently, who seemed to appear and vanish at will. Some accounts describe entire Soviet units becoming paralyzed by fear of an enemy they couldn't see coming and couldn't chase down. Soviet training had prepared these men for open warfare, mass formations, artillery barrage, direct assault. Nothing had prepared them for an enemy that refused to ever stand still long enough to be shot at. One name became particularly feared among Soviet troops on this front, a quiet Finnish farmer and marksman named Simo Hai, who, moving alone through the snow in white camouflage, using iron sights rather than a scope to avoid the telltale glint of light on glass, was credited with an extraordinary number of confirmed kills during the war, almost all in the space of about 3 months. Soviet troops called him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. Just the name, whispered between exhausted soldiers, was enough to make some units abandon standard patrol routes altogether. This is what a motti pocket actually was, in the end. Not just an encirclement, A slow psychological unraveling cold, starvation, isolation, and an invisible enemy grinding a modern mechanized army down from the inside until entire divisions simply stopped functioning as fighting forces. At Suomussalmi, the motti tactic achieved something almost impossible to believe on paper. Siilasvuo's forces heavily outnumbered encircled and effectively destroyed two entire Soviet divisions, the 163rd and the 44th. Soviet losses in that single battle are estimated in the tens of thousands, against a fraction of that number of Finnish casualties. It remains one of the most lopsided military victories of the 20th century. But this story has a second half. And it isn't a victory. Years before the war began, Finland's actual commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, had repeatedly warned his own government that the country's main defensive line, a fortified strip across the Karelian Isthmus that would come to bear his name, was dangerously underfunded and undermanned. He asked for more artillery, more concrete fortifications, more reserves. Peacetime politicians, confident a full-scale invasion was unlikely, largely brushed the warnings aside. War felt distant. Money felt more urgent elsewhere. The motti tactic that worked so brilliantly at Suomussalmi needed one thing to function: dense forest, narrow roads, room to encircle and isolate. It was a weapon built for the wilderness. The Karelian Isthmus, the main Soviet axis of attack, the most direct road to Helsinki itself, was different. More open ground. Fewer forests to hide ski patrols in. And by February 1940, the Soviets had learned from their humiliation. They stopped sending men down single roads to be cut apart. They massed overwhelming artillery instead of bombardment, so relentless Finnish soldiers came to call it simply the Great Cannonade, and simply ground the Mannerheim line down through sheer weight of steel. The tactic that had saved Finland in the forests of the north could not be replicated where the terrain and the years of underinvestment wouldn't allow it. The line that Mannerheim had begged for the resources to properly build finally broke. Finland, having won nearly every battle in the wilderness, was forced to the negotiating table anyway, and in March 1940, signed a peace that ceded roughly 10% of its territory. Arrogance, in this war, cut both ways. Stalin's arrogance handed Finland its miracle in the forests. Peacetime arrogance back home cost Finland the ground it couldn't afford to give. Finland's winter war lasted just over 3 months. It did not end the way Stalin's 12-day timeline promised. And it did not end the way Siilasvuo's forest ambushes might have suggested either. It ended in the gray middle ground, where most real wars actually finish not with total victory, and not with total defeat, but with a small nation proving, at devastating cost to both sides, that it could not simply be erased. Hjalmar Siilasvuo, the overlooked reserve officer, the lawyer nobody expected to become a symbol of Finnish resistance, would go on to be remembered as one of the architects of a strategy still studied in military academies today, proof that a smaller, faster, more adaptable force can, under the right conditions, dismantle a giant piece by piece. But go back, for a moment, to that first column. That forest road, somewhere near Suomussalmi, in the last days of 1939. Picture the officers again, before the silence. The ones who packed light because they'd been told this would be over in 12 days. The ones who joked about a parade through Helsinki. The ones who never bothered with white camouflage, because why would they need it? This wasn't a war. It was a formality. Somewhere out past the tree line, men on skis were already moving into position. Quiet, patient, invisible against the snow. Stalin had called Finland's army a formality. The silence that followed was the sound of an empire finding out exactly how wrong he was.